The train whistle cut through the October air like a widow's cry, sharp and lonesome against the endless Montana sky. Marguerite Lindquist, Maren, as she'd been called since her tongue first learned to wrap around syllables, pressed her gloved palm flat against the cold window glass, watching the landscape transform from rolling golden prairie to something wilder, something that seemed to breathe with ancient patience. She had counted the days in stitches. 437 cross-stitches on the sampler she'd worked during the journey from Minnesota, each tiny X a prayer, a hope, a desperate bargain with whatever God still listened to women who sold themselves through newspaper advertisements. The sampler read "Home Sweet Home" in cheerful blue thread, though the words felt hollow as a dried gourd rattling in her carpet bag. "Mr. Harold Finch," she recited silently, the name worn smooth from repetition. "Prosperous rancher, 42 years of age, seeks companion of sturdy constitution and agreeable temperament." The advertisement had said nothing of love. Maren hadn't expected it to. Love was a luxury for women who hadn't buried a father in a pauper's grave, who hadn't watched their mother's mind slip away like water through cracked fingers, who hadn't spent 3 years scrubbing other people's floors until their knuckles bled and their backs screamed for mercy. Love was for women who had choices. Maren had stopped believing in choices the day the bank took the farm. "Copper Creek Station. 5 minutes to Copper Creek." The conductor's voice jolted her upright. She caught her reflection in the window, a pale oval face, hair the color of winter wheat pulled back in a sensible knot, eyes the gray-blue of storm clouds gathering over Lake Superior. 24 years old, and already she could see the beginning of lines at the corners of those eyes, the permanent furrow between her brows that spoke of too many worries carried too young. "You're not ugly," she told herself firmly, the same words she'd repeated every morning since posting her response to Mr. Finch's advertisement. "You're not beautiful either, but you're not ugly. You're capable." That's what matters. She'd included a photograph with her letter, the only one she owned, taken 3 years ago when Papa was still alive, and there was money for such frivolities. She'd been honest in her correspondence, describing herself as of medium height and unremarkable appearance, but possessed of good health and a willingness to work. Mr. Finch's return letters had been brief, businesslike, and reassuring in their very mundanity. He'd written of his cattle, his land, his need for a woman to manage his household. He'd enclosed money for her passage and a pressed wildflower that she'd kept between the pages of her Bible. The train began to slow, its iron wheels screaming against the track. Maren gathered her belongings with trembling hands, the carpet-bag containing everything she owned, the small trunk in the baggage car that held her mother's quilt and her grandmother's china teapot, the only treasures she'd refused to sell. She smoothed her traveling dress, a serviceable brown wool that had seen better days but was clean and neatly pressed. First impressions mattered. Mr. Finch had paid good money for her passage. The least she could do was arrive looking respectable. "Please," she prayed as the train shuddered to a stop. "Please let him be kind. I don't need love. I don't need passion. Just kindness. Just a roof and safety and someone who won't—" She couldn't finish the thought. The memories of her last employer's wandering hands, his wife's jealous accusations, the door slammed in her face without references or final wages, those memories had no place on this platform, in this new beginning. Maren stepped off the train into chaos. Copper Creek was larger than she'd expected, a bustling frontier town that seemed to be bursting at its seams with humanity. The platform swarmed with people,
cowboys and dusty chaps, women in calico dresses, children darting between legs like minnows in a stream. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse manure and something else, something wild and clean that she would later learn was simply Montana. She stood clutching her carpet bag, eyes scanning the crowd for a man matching Mr. Finch's description. Tall, he'd written, gray at the temples. I'll be wearing a black coat and carrying a sign with your name. The platform began to clear. Families reunited with embraces and tears.
Businessmen strode purposefully toward waiting carriages. Cowboys mounted horses and disappeared in clouds of dust. The October wind picked up, cutting through Maren's wool dress like it was made of paper. No black coat, no sign, no Mr. Harold Finch. He's late, she told herself. Ranchers are busy men. He's simply been delayed. She moved to a bench near the station house, positioning herself where she could see anyone approaching. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained whiskers, gave her a curious look as he passed, but said nothing. A woman in a fine green dress swept by with her nose in the air, trailing expensive perfume in disdain. 1 hour passed, then 2. The sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. The platform had long since emptied. Even the station master had retreated inside, leaving Maren alone with her carpet bag and her growing dread. He's not coming. The thought arrived with terrible clarity, settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She'd heard stories, of course, everyone had. Mail-order brides abandoned at stations, their intended husbands having second thoughts or finding other arrangements or simply forgetting. She told herself it wouldn't happen to her. Mr. Finch's letters had been so practical, so sensible. He'd seemed like a man who kept his word. But here she sat, alone on a wooden bench in a town where she knew no one, with $17 in her purse and nowhere to go. "Don't cry," she commanded herself fiercely. "Don't you dare cry. Tears never fixed anything." The station door opened, and Maren's head snapped up, hope flaring like a struck match. But it was only a young man in a deputy star, stepping out to light a cigarette. He noticed her sitting there and frowned. "Ma'am, you been waiting on someone?" "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Mr. Harold Finch. He was supposed to meet me." The deputy's expression shifted. Surprise, then something that looked uncomfortably like pity. He took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "Ma'am, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but Harold Finch passed 3 weeks ago. Horse threw him out near Miller's Creek. Broke his neck." The world tilted. Maren gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles going white. That's not possible. I received a letter from him just... His sister's been handling his affairs. Might be she didn't know about. The deputy's eyes dropped to her carpet bag, to the traveling dress, and understanding dawned in his face. Oh, hell. You're the mail-order bride." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and bare. Maren felt heat flood her cheeks even as cold dread pooled in her stomach. "I am Mr. Finch's intended," she said, clinging to what little dignity remained. "If you could direct me to his sister—" "Beatrice Finch took the ranch and everything on it. Sold what she could, moved back east last week." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "I'm real sorry, ma'am. If there's anything—" "No." Maren stood, her legs somehow supporting her weight despite feeling like they'd turned to water. Thank you for the information, Deputy. She walked to the edge of the platform on wooden legs, staring out at the town of Copper Creek, this place that was supposed to be her salvation, her new beginning. The shops were closing for the evening. Lamplighters moved along the main street, their flames pushing back the gathering darkness. Somewhere, a piano played a jaunty tune that felt like mockery. $17. No references, no connections. Winter coming. She'd survived worse. She'd survived her father's death and her mother's madness, and the loss of everything she'd ever known. She'd survived men who saw her as prey, and women who saw her as competition, and a world that had no use for poor, plain, unconnected girls except as labor to be exploited. She would survive this too. But God, she was tired of surviving. "Ma'am?" The voice came from behind her, deep and quiet, with a roughness to it that suggested it wasn't used often. Maren turned. The man standing at the far end of the platform was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn work clothes that had seen years of hard use. His hat shadowed his face, but she could see a strong jaw dark with stubble, and eyes that caught the fading light like chips of amber. He stood very still, the way she'd seen deer stand at the edge of clearings, watchful, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said. His voice was barely above a murmur, and she had to strain to catch the words. "About Finch, about your situation." Maren's spine stiffened. She'd dealt with men who offered help to desperate women before. Her hand moved instinctively toward her carpet bag, where a small knife was hidden in the lining. "I require no assistance, sir." He didn't move closer, didn't smile or try to charm. He simply stood there, turning his hat in his hands. She realized he'd removed it at some point, revealing dark hair shot through with early gray, despite a face that couldn't have seen more than 30 winters. "There's a boarding house," he said. "Mrs. Chen's place, 2 streets over. She's decent, fair prices, won't ask questions." It wasn't what she'd expected. Maren studied him more closely, searching for the trap, the hidden motive. But his eyes, when they finally met hers, held nothing but a kind of quiet, painful understanding. The look of someone who knew what it meant to be stranded, to be alone, to be at the mercy of a world that showed no mercy. "Why would you tell me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "Because someone should have told me once and didn't." Before she could respond, before she could ask his name or thank him or demand to know what game he was playing, he turned and walked away into the gathering dark. She watched him go, watched the way he moved, careful and contained, like a man who had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. The lamplighter reached their end of the street, and for just a moment the light caught the stranger's face in profile. He was looking back at her. Then the shadows swallowed him whole, and Maren was alone again on the platform, clutching her carpet bag and her $17, and the strange, inexplicable feeling that something important had just happened, something she couldn't yet name, couldn't yet understand. The wind picked up, carrying the first bitter promise of winter. And somewhere in the darkness a church bell began to toll. The church bell tolled 7 times before falling silent, and with each resonant strike Maren felt the last threads of her composure fray a little more. She had been standing on this platform for nearly 2 hours. The station master had retreated inside his office, though she caught him peering at her through the grimy window every few minutes, his expression cycling between pity and suspicion. The evening had turned bitter, and her thin wool coat, perfectly adequate for Minnesota autumns, proved laughably insufficient against the Montana wind that seemed to blow straight down from the mountains with teeth of ice. Her fingers had long since gone numb around the handle of her carpet-bag. "Think," she commanded herself. "You've survived worse than this. You've buried your father and held your mother's hand while she forgot your name. You've endured Mr. Henrikson's wandering hands and his wife's cruel accusations. You've walked away from everything you ever knew with $17 and a stranger's promise. Think." The town of Copper Creek stretched before her in the gathering darkness. A single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a few side streets disappearing into shadows, and beyond it all, the vast emptiness of the Montana Territory. She could see the warm glow of lamplight in windows, could hear the distant sounds of a piano playing something jaunty from what she assumed was a saloon. Normal life continuing without her, utterly indifferent to her predicament. She had three options as far as she could determine. She could spend what little money she had on a room at the hotel she'd glimpsed from the train, a weathered building with a sign reading Copper Creek House in faded letters. That would buy her perhaps a week, maybe less, and then she'd be destitute in a strange town with no prospects and no connections. She could attempt to find Harold Finch herself. Perhaps there had been some emergency, some unavoidable circumstance that had prevented him from meeting her. Perhaps he was even now racing toward the station, full of apologies and explanations. Or she could get back on the next eastbound train and return to... what? The boarding house in St. Paul where she'd spent her last $3 on a week's rent before leaving? The empty farmhouse that now belonged to the bank? The grave where her father lay beneath Minnesota soil that she might never see again? There was no going back. There had never been any going back. That was the cruel mathematics of desperation. It only ever moved in one direction. The station master's door creaked open, and the elderly man emerged with obvious reluctance, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "Miss," he called out, his voice carrying a note of weary obligation. "Miss, the station closes at 8. You can't stay here all night." "I understand." Maren forced her voice to remain steady. "Could you tell me, is there a Harold Finch who lives in this area? A rancher?" The station master's expression shifted in a way that made her stomach clench. Not surprise, something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like recognition mixed with distaste. "Finch," he repeated, and the name came out flat. "You're here for Finch?" Yes, I'm supposed to meet him. He was to collect me from the train." The old man rubbed the back of his neck, looking everywhere but at her face. "Miss, I don't rightly know how to tell you this, but Harold Finch left Copper Creek 3 days ago. Sold his place to a cattle company out of Helena and lit out for California, or so I heard tell." The words didn't make sense at first. They arrived in her ears as sounds without meaning, like a foreign language she'd never learned. "That's not possible," she heard herself say. "He wrote to me. He sent money for my ticket. I'm just telling you what I know, miss." The station master's voice had gentled somewhat, though he still wouldn't meet her eyes. "Finch wasn't what you'd call a reliable man. Had debts all over town. The cattle company paid enough to clear most of them, and he was gone before the ink dried on the papers. Maren's knees threatened to buckle. She locked them through sheer force of will, gripping her carpetbag so tightly that the worn leather handle bit into her palm. "Is there a boarding house?" Her voice came out strange and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "Somewhere I might find lodging for the night?" "The Copper Creek house takes boarders, but—" The station master hesitated. "Miss, I don't mean to pry into your affairs, but do you have anyone you can wire? Family, maybe? Someone who could send for you?" "No," she thought. "There is no one. There is nothing."
I am 24 years old and utterly alone in the world, and the man who promised me safety and a home has vanished like smoke. "I'll manage," she said, because that was what she always said, what she had always had to say. "Thank you for your help." She turned toward the town, toward the distant lights that suddenly seemed very far away, and took one step before a voice stopped her. "Miss Lindquist?" It was a man's voice, deep and quiet, with a slight roughness to it, like stones tumbling in a riverbed. She turned. He stood at the edge of the platform, half in shadow, and she realized with a start that it was the same man she'd glimpsed earlier, the tall figure in the worn coat who'd been watching from the street. Up close, she could see more of him: broad shoulders, work-roughened hands, a face that was all angles and weathered planes beneath the brim of a battered hat. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older, it was hard to tell. There was something timeless about his features, something carved by wind and sun and hard labor, but it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were the gray of winter sky before snow, and they held an expression she couldn't quite read, something between concern and a peculiar, almost pained uncertainty. "How do you know my name?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with the fear she'd been trying so hard to suppress. "I was there when the letters came." He spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word required deliberation. "To the post office. Finch." He read parts of them aloud. "At the saloon." The humiliation of it washed over her like ice water. Her letters, her private words, her careful hopes, her desperate need, read aloud for the entertainment of strangers in a saloon. "I see." She couldn't keep the tremor from her voice. "And you've come to— what? Gawk at the abandoned bride? Tell me what a fool I've been?" Something flickered in those gray eyes, hurt, perhaps, or surprise. He took a step back and she saw his jaw tighten. "No, ma'am. I came to—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with something, then began again. "I have a ranch, 3 miles out of town. It's not much, but there's a house, a cabin, really. And I need—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to his boots. The station master, who had been watching this exchange with undisguised interest, let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be— Silas Drummond speaking more than 2 words together. That's a first." The man, Silas, shot the station master a look that might have been irritation, though his expression barely changed. He returned his attention to Maren, and she saw him square his shoulders as if bracing for a blow. "I'm not good with words, Miss Lindquist. Never have been. But I'm offering you shelter, a place to stay while you figure out what comes next. No obligations, no expectations." He paused, and something almost like pain crossed his features. "I know how it looks, a stranger making such an offer, but I swear to you on my mother's grave that you'd be safe.
Safer than you'd be at the Copper Creek house where Jed Miller waters down the whiskey and his wife gossips worse than a telegraph wire. Maren stared at him. The wind howled around them, driving needles of cold through her inadequate coat, and she felt the weight of her exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical thing. Every instinct she'd developed over years of hardship screamed at her to refuse. She didn't know this man.
She didn't know anyone in this godforsaken town. For all she knew, he was worse than Harold Finch, worse than Mr. Hendrickson, worse than any of the men who had taught her that the world was not kind to women alone. But there was something in his face, something in the awkward, almost painful way he held himself, as if the very act of speaking to her cost him dearly, that gave her pause. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you offer such a thing to a stranger?" Silas Drummond was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "Because I know what it is to be left behind. And because—" He stopped, swallowed hard, and finished in a rush. "Because I was gone to answer that advertisement myself, before Finch did. I couldn't find the words." The confession hung between them in the frozen air, raw and unexpected. Maren felt something shift in her chest, not trust, not yet, but the faintest possibility of it. "The cabin," she said slowly. "Is there a lock on the door?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you'd have the only key." She looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who seemed almost as lost as she felt, a man who spoke as if words were precious coins he couldn't afford to spend. "One night," she heard herself say. "I'll stay one night, and we'll discuss arrangements in the morning." Relief washed over his weathered features, followed immediately by something that looked almost like terror. He nodded once, sharply, and gestured toward the darkness beyond the platform. "I have a wagon. It's not much, but there are blankets." Maren picked up her carpet bag and followed him into the night, acutely aware that she was placing her life in the hands of a man she'd known for all of 5 minutes. But as she climbed onto the rough wooden seat of his wagon, as he draped a wool blanket around her shoulders with hands that trembled slightly, she realized something that both comforted and terrified her. Harold Finch's letters had been full of pretty words and empty promises. Silas Drummond could barely string a sentence together. And somehow, impossibly, that made her trust him more. The wagon lurched forward into the darkness, and behind them the church bell began to toll again, 8 times now, marking the hour, marking the moment when Maren Lindquist's life turned in a direction she never could have predicted. Ahead, the mountains loomed black against a sky full of stars, and somewhere in those vast, unknowable distances, a wolf began to howl. The wagon road wound through darkness so complete that Maren could see nothing beyond the pale breath of the horses and the faint gleam of starlight on Silas Drummond's profile. He had not spoken since they left town, and she had not pressed him. The silence between them felt different from the oppressive quiet of the train platform, less like abandonment and more like the stillness of deep water, something that required patience to navigate. The cold had intensified, biting through her wool coat and settling into her bones with the persistence of an old ache. She tucked her hands deeper into her sleeves and watched the mountains grow larger against the star-scattered sky, their peaks still crowned with snow that seemed to glow with an inner light. "Storm coming," Silas said finally, his voice low and rough from disuse.
"Tomorrow."
"Maybe the day after." Maren glanced at the clear sky.
How can you tell? Horses know. Air feels different. He shifted on the bench, and she caught the slight grimace that crossed his features. Some old injury protesting the cold, perhaps. You'll learn to read it if you stay. If you stay. The words hung between them, neither promise nor threat, simply acknowledgment of the uncertain ground on which they both stood. I intend to stay, Mr. Drummond. He made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been doubt. The wagon creaked on through the darkness. They arrived at the ranch house just past 9 o'clock, though it felt much later. The building emerged from the darkness like something grown from the land itself, a 2-story structure of weathered timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and disappeared into shadow. Lamplight glowed in 2 windows, warm and welcoming against the cold. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop before the porch steps and climbed down stiffly. Before Maren could move, he had circled to her side and offered his hand, rough, calloused, surprisingly warm despite the chill. "Watch your step."
The second board's loose. She took his hand and descended carefully, her boots finding solid ground. The air smelled of pine smoke and hay and something else, something wild and clean that she couldn't name. Montana, she thought. This is what Montana smells like. The front door opened and a small figure appeared in the rectangle of light, a child, slight and pale, with a cloud of copper-red hair that seemed to catch fire in the lamplight. She stood perfectly still, watching them with eyes that held the same watchful quality as her father's. "Emmeline," Silas said, and his voice changed, softened. "This is Miss Lindquist. She'll be staying with us for a while." The girl's gaze shifted to Maren, assessing, measuring, revealing nothing. She was perhaps 8 years old, dressed in a nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders, and she held herself with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural in a child so young. Maren stepped forward, careful to keep her movements slow and unthreatening. "Hello, Emmeline. I'm very pleased to meet you." The girl's expression didn't change.
She looked at Maren for a long moment, then turned her attention to her father and made a series of quick, precise gestures with her hands. A private language, Maren realized. Something developed between just the 2 of them. Silas's jaw tightened. He signed something back, his large hand surprisingly deft, and Emmeline's mouth pressed into a thin line. Without another glance at Maren, she turned and disappeared into the house, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The warmth that had begun to bloom in Maren's chest withered. "She doesn't talk much," Silas said, though the explanation felt inadequate. He gathered Maren's trunk from the wagon bed with an ease that spoke of years of hard labor. "Not to strangers." "I understand." Maren kept her voice steady, though something in her heart ached at the memory of those guarded eyes. She knew that look. She had worn it herself once, in the months after her father's death when the world had seemed full of threats and false promises. "She doesn't know me. She has no reason to trust me." Silas paused on the porch steps, her trunk balanced on his shoulder. In the lamplight spilling from the open door, she could see the conflict on his face, the warring impulses of hope and fear that she suspected had driven him to step forward on that platform. "Emmeline is—" He stopped, searching for words that seemed to elude him. "She's been through things a child shouldn't have to go through. Her mother's death hit her hard. She hasn't spoken a full sentence to anyone outside this ranch since the funeral." The weight of that confession settled over Maren like a physical thing. A child who had lost her mother,
who had retreated so far into silence that even words had become too dangerous to share. She thought of her own mother, lost in a different way, still breathing but gone nonetheless, trapped in a mind that no longer recognized the daughter who loved her. "How long ago?" Maren asked softly. "The funeral?" 2 years. Silas's voice was barely audible. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. He climbed the remaining steps and carried her trunk inside, leaving Maren alone on the porch with the weight of his grief and the howl of that distant wolf still echoing in her memory.
The house was warmer than she had expected, heated by a large stone fireplace in the main room and a cast-iron stove in the kitchen. Silas showed her to a small bedroom on the second floor, simply furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest for her belongings, and left her with a promise of breakfast at dawn. Maren unpacked her trunk by candlelight, hanging her 2 spare dresses on the hooks behind the door and placing her mother's Bible on the small table beside the bed. The room smelled of cedar and dust and something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, dried and faded but still present. She wondered if this had been Colleen Drummond's room, if these walls had witnessed the last years of a marriage cut short by death. Sleep came slowly, chased by thoughts of the child down the hall who would not speak, and the man below who could barely manage words himself. She had come to Montana seeking safety and found something far more complicated. A household held together by silence and grief. A family that had learned to communicate without language because language had failed them. She dreamed of her mother's face, young and laughing, and woke to the gray light of dawn with tears on her cheeks. Breakfast was salt pork, biscuits, and coffee so strong it could have stripped paint. Maren ate at the kitchen table, while Silas stood by the window, watching the sky with the same focused attention he might have given an approaching enemy. Emmeline was nowhere to be seen. "Storm's closer than I thought," he said. "Day after tomorrow at the latest. I need to ride out to the north pasture, check on the herd." He turned to face her, and she saw the question in his eyes before he spoke it. "Emmeline stays here. Mrs. Hargrave from town usually comes out when I need to be away, but with the storm coming—" "I'll stay with her." The words came out before Maren could second-guess them. "If she'll have me." Silas studied her for a long moment, that same measuring gaze his daughter had inherited. "She won't make it easy." "I don't expect her to." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of respect. He nodded once, pulled on his coat, and left through the back door without another word. Maren washed the breakfast dishes and explored the house with careful steps, learning its geography. The main room with its fireplace and worn furniture, the kitchen with its iron stove and shelves of preserved vegetables, a small study that smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, its desk covered in papers that she did not examine, and everywhere small signs of a woman's touch, embroidered cushions, dried flowers, and chipped vases, a sampler on the wall that read, "Home is where the heart rests." She found Emmeline in the barn. The girl was sitting in an empty stall, her back against the wooden wall, a book open in her lap. She looked up when Maren's shadow fell across the doorway, and her entire body went rigid with weariness. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Maren said, keeping her voice soft. "I was just exploring. Your father showed me the house, but not the barn." Emmeline said nothing. Her fingers tightened on the book. Little Women, Maren noted, the spine well worn from reading. "That's one of my favorites." Maren stayed in the doorway, making no move to come closer. "I always wanted to be Joe, but I think I'm probably more of a Beth."
Still nothing.
But Emmeline's grip on the book loosened slightly. "I'll leave you to your reading." Maren turned to go, then paused. "If you need anything, I'll be in the kitchen. I thought I might try to make bread, though. I should warn you, my mother always said my loaves could be used as doorstops." She walked away without looking back, her heart pounding with an anxiety she couldn't quite explain. This was not a battle that could be won with a single conversation. Trust was built slowly, brick by brick, and Emmeline Drummond had every reason to keep her walls high and strong. The morning passed in quiet industry. Maren found flour and yeast in the kitchen stores and set about making bread, her movements automatic from years of practice despite her self-deprecating joke. The dough was rising by the stove when she heard footsteps on the back porch, too light to be Silas, too deliberate to be accidental. Emmeline stood in the kitchen doorway, her book clutched to her chest like a shield. She watched Maren for a long moment, then crossed to the table and set something down with careful precision. A folded piece of paper. Maren wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. Inside, in a child's careful handwriting, were 4 words. Joe would never give up. She looked up to find Emmeline watching her with those guarded, knowing eyes. Not acceptance, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall. "No," Maren agreed softly. She wouldn't. Emmeline held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, then turned and disappeared back into the house, leaving Maren alone with the rising bread and a hope she hadn't dared to feel since she'd first stepped off that train. Outside, the wind was picking up, and in the distance clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of the coming storm. And somewhere in the north pasture, Silas Drummond had no idea that the blizzard would arrive a full day earlier than he'd predicted. The storm descended upon the ranch like a living thing, hungry, relentless, and far more vicious than anyone had anticipated. Maren had just pulled the second loaf of bread from the oven when the first gust of wind struck the house with enough force to rattle the windows in their frames. She steadied herself against the counter, watching as the world beyond the kitchen glass transformed from gray afternoon into swirling white chaos in what seemed like mere minutes. "Miss?" The voice came from behind her, small, uncertain, and decidedly male. Maren turned to find a boy standing in the kitchen doorway. He was tall for his age, all gangly limbs and sharp elbows, with a constellation of freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks. His hair was the color of autumn wheat, standing up in several directions as though he'd recently been sleeping, and his eyes, a warm hazel that reminded her of someone, though she couldn't place who, watched her with undisguised curiosity. "You must be Miss Lindquist," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Pa told me, well, not Pa, he's dead, but Uncle Silas told me before he left this morning that there might be a lady here when I got back from the Hendersons' place, and I was supposed to help with whatever needed helping. Only the storm came faster than anyone thought, and I had to shelter in the barn for nearly an hour before I could make it to the house, and—" He paused, drawing a breath. "I'm Theodore Drummond." "I'm 11. Maren felt the corners of her mouth twitch despite herself. After the weighted silences of Silas and Emmeline, this boy's nervous chatter felt almost musical. "I'm pleased to meet you, Theo," she said. "And yes, I'm Maren Lindquist. Are you going to marry Uncle Silas?" The question burst out before Theo could seemingly stop it, and a flush crept up his neck. "Sorry. Ma always said I talk before I think. My other Ma, I mean. The first one. Not the—" He stopped himself, his expression flickering with something that looked like shame. "Never mind." Maren's heart clenched. She recognized that look. The desperate need to explain, to justify, to fill every silence before someone else could fill it with judgment. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," she answered honestly. "Your uncle was kind enough to offer me shelter from the storm. Beyond that, we haven't discussed much." Theo nodded vigorously, as if this made perfect sense. "Uncle Silas doesn't discuss much of anything. He's quiet, real quiet, but not in a mean way, you know. Just, he says what needs saying and nothing else." The boy moved further into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of fresh bread. "Did you make that? It smells like my ma's used to. My first ma, I mean." "Would you like some? It's still warm." The look of naked longing on his face was answer enough. Maren cut a thick slice and spread it with butter from the crock she'd found in the cold cellar, and Theo accepted it with both hands as though she'd given him something precious. "Emmeline doesn't talk," he said between bites, apparently deciding that Maren needed to be informed of this fact. "Well, she talks to Uncle Silas, with her hands, I mean, and sometimes she talks to the horses, but she won't talk to me, even though I've been here almost 2 years now," he chewed thoughtfully. "I think she's scared." "Scared of what?" "Of caring about people." Theo shrugged, but his eyes were too old for his young face. "People leave, or they die, or they decide they don't want you anymore." He said it matter-of-factly, as though stating that water was wet or the sky was blue. "I think Emmeline figures if she doesn't let anyone in, it won't hurt so bad when they go." Maren had to turn away, busying herself with wiping down the counter that was already clean. This boy, this child who spoke of abandonment with such casual familiarity, had cracked something open inside her chest. "That sounds very lonely," she said quietly. "It is." Theo finished his bread and wiped his hands on his trousers. "But I keep trying anyway. Uncle Silas says that's what Drummonds do. We keep trying." Another gust of wind screamed around the corner of the house, and Maren glanced toward the window with growing unease. The snow was falling so thick now that she could barely see the barn, and it was only mid-afternoon. "Where is Emmeline?" she asked. "Probably in her room. She goes there when storms come, doesn't like the noise." Theo's brow furrowed. "Where's Uncle Silas?" "The north pasture. He said something about bringing the cattle closer before the storm hit." Theo's face went pale beneath his freckles. "The north pasture? But that's almost 3 miles out, and the storm wasn't supposed to come until tomorrow. He left this morning. Surely he would have seen the weather changing and headed back." But even as she said it, Maren remembered Silas's words from the night before. "The north herd is scattered. Some of them have wandered into the draws. It'll take most of the day to round them up. Most of the day, in weather like this." "I need to check the barn," Theo said, already moving toward the back door. "If his horse came back without him—" "Wait!" Maren caught his arm. "You can't go out there. The visibility is nearly nothing." "I know this ranch blindfolded, Miss Lindquist. I've been walking the same path to the barn twice a day for 2 years. Theo's voice had lost its nervous quality, replaced by something harder, older. "If Uncle Silas is out there in this, someone needs to know." He pulled on his coat before Maren could argue further, and disappeared into the swirling white. She watched him go, her hands pressed against the cold glass of the window, counting the seconds until his figure vanished entirely from view. The house felt suddenly enormous around her, empty.
The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere upstairs, a door creaked. Emmeline moving in her room, unaware that her father might be lost in the very storm that frightened her so. Maren paced. She checked the bread. She added wood to the fire. She paced again.
When the back door finally burst open and Theo stumbled through, his face was red with cold and his eyes were bright with barely contained panic. "His horse isn't there," he gasped. "Whiskey's stall is empty. He never came back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy as the snow piling against the windows. "What do we do?" Maren asked. "We can't go after him. Not in this." Theo's voice cracked. "Even if we knew exactly where he was, we'd never make it. The temperature's dropping fast, and when the sun goes down—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Maren thought of Silas Drummond, that quiet, steady man who had stepped forward when no one else would, who had offered her shelter and asked nothing in return. She thought of his careful hands and his measured words, and the way he had looked at his daughter with such fierce, protective love. She thought of him alone in that wide emptiness, the cold seeping into his bones, the snow erasing every landmark until there was nothing left but the howling wind and the creeping certainty of death. "The neighbors," she said. "Is there anyone close enough to—" "The Hendersons are 4 miles east." "The Carters are 6 miles south." Theo shook his head. "No one's riding anywhere tonight." A small sound from the doorway made them both turn. Emmeline stood at the bottom of the stairs, her red hair loose around her shoulders and her face as white as the snow beyond the windows. Her hands moved in quick, sharp gestures, too fast for Maren to follow, but Theo understood. "She wants to know where her pa is," he translated, his voice rough. Maren looked at the girl, this silent, wounded child who had already lost so much, and felt the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders. She could lie. She could soften the truth. She could protect Emmeline from the fear that was clawing at her own chest. But something in those pale eyes told her that Emmeline had already survived worse truths than this one. And she deserved honesty, even when honesty was cruel. "Your father went to the north pasture this morning," Maren said slowly, clearly. "The storm came earlier than expected. He hasn't returned yet." Emmeline's hands fell to her sides. For a long moment she simply stared at Maren, her expression unreadable. Then her chin lifted and her fingers moved again, slower this time, deliberate. Theo's breath caught. She says there's a line cabin about a mile into the North Range. Pa built it 3 years ago after a bad winter. If he couldn't make it back, he'd go there. Would he have supplies? A way to stay warm? More signing. Theo nodded. She says there's always wood stacked inside, and emergency provisions, blankets, everything someone would need to survive a storm. Hope flickered in Maren's chest, small and fragile but real. Then we wait. We keep the fires burning and the lights in the windows, and we wait for him to come home. Emmeline's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. They were both women who knew what it meant to wait, to hope, to hold themselves together when everything inside wanted to shatter. The girl moved then, crossing the kitchen to stand beside the window. She pressed one small hand against the glass, her breath fogging the surface, and stared out into the storm as though she could will her father home through sheer force of love. Maren joined her on one side, Theo on the other. And together the three of them kept vigil as the blizzard raged and the night crept closer, each of them praying to whatever God might be listening that Silas Drummond had found shelter before the cold could claim him. The hours crawled past. Maren made soup, Theo kept the fires fed, Emmeline never moved from her post at the window. It was nearly midnight when the girl suddenly stiffened, her hand flying to Maren's arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "What is it?" Maren peered into the darkness, seeing nothing but snow and shadow. "Emmeline, what do you—" And then she heard it, faint beneath the howling wind, a sound that made her heart stop and then race with desperate hope. The whinny of a horse. The horse emerged from the swirling white like a phantom, its dark coat crusted with ice and snow. Maren's breath caught in her throat as she made out the figure slumped forward in the saddle, barely clinging to the horn with frozen hands. "Silas!" She was moving before she could think, throwing open the door and plunging into the biting cold. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and driving ice crystals into her face. She stumbled down the porch steps, her thin house shoes immediately soaking through in the accumulated snow. The horse, she recognized it now as the big bay gelding from the barn, stopped at the edge of the yard, its sides heaving with exhaustion. Silas didn't move, didn't acknowledge her approach. In the faint light spilling from the house, she could see that his lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and frost clung to his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. "Mr. Drummond." She reached up, grasping his arm through the frozen fabric of his coat. "Silas, can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused and glazed. "Made it," he rasped, the words barely audible above the wind. Told her I'd come back." "You did. You're home." Maren tugged at his arm, trying to help him dismount. "But I need you to help me. I can't carry you." For a long moment she feared he was too far gone to understand. Then something shifted in his expression, a flicker of awareness, of stubborn determination, and he swung his leg over the saddle with painful slowness. When his boots hit the ground, his knees buckled immediately. Maren caught him, staggering under his weight. He was a solid man, all muscle and bone, and she was not a large woman. But she braced herself against him, one arm around his waist, and began the agonizing journey toward the house. "Theo," she called, her voice cracking. "Theo, I need help." The boy appeared in the doorway, his face pale in the lamplight. He took one look at the situation and bounded down the steps, ducking under Silas's other arm to help support him. "Is he gonna die?" Theo's voice trembled, but his grip was steady. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Maren didn't know where the certainty came from, but she clung to it like a lifeline. "We need to get him warm. Slowly, not too fast, or we could do more harm than good." Together they half carried, half dragged Silas up the porch steps and through the door. The warmth of the house hit Maren like a wave, making her realize how numb her own extremities had become in just those few minutes outside. Emmeline stood in the parlor doorway, her small face white as chalk, her eyes enormous with fear. She made a sound, the first vocalization Maren had heard from her, a high, keening whimper that cut straight to the heart. "He's alive, Emmeline." Maren met the girl's terrified gaze. "Your father is alive, and we're going to take care of him. But I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" The child's hands moved in rapid, jerky signs that Maren couldn't interpret, but Theo responded immediately. "She wants to know what she can do. Get blankets, all the blankets you can find, and put them by the fire to warm,
but not too close. We don't want them to scorch." Emmeline fled up the stairs, her footsteps rapid on the wooden treads. Maren and Theo guided Silas to the settee near the fireplace, easing him down onto the worn cushions. His eyes had closed again, and his breathing was shallow and labored. "His clothes are soaked through," Maren said, her mind racing through everything she'd learned about treating cold exposure back in Minnesota, where such knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. "We need to get them off. Theo, can you help me with his boots?" The boy nodded, already kneeling to work at the frozen laces. Maren tackled the buttons of Silas's coat, her own fingers clumsy and half numb. The fabric was stiff with ice, fighting her at every turn.
"What happened out there?" Theo asked, his voice strained with the effort of pulling at the stubborn boots.
"He knows better than to get caught in a storm."
"The storm came early. You said so yourself."
Maren finally won her battle with the coat buttons and began working on the shirt beneath. She tried not to think about the impropriety of undressing a man she'd known for less than 2 days. Survival trumped modesty. "He was probably already on his way back when it hit." The boots came off, revealing socks that were soaked through and feet that were an alarming shade of grayish white. Maren's stomach clenched with fear. Frostbite. If it had progressed too far, he could lose toes. He could lose his feet. Emmeline reappeared, her arms full of quilts and wool blankets. She'd clearly raided every bed in the house, and the pile was so large she could barely see over it. She dumped them on the floor near the fire, then turned to face Maren with an expression of fierce determination. "Good girl," Maren said softly. "Now I need warm water. Not hot, just warm. Can you fill a basin from the kettle on the stove? And Theo, I need you to mix it with cold water until it's barely lukewarm."
"We'll use it to gradually warm his feet and hands." Both children sprang into action. Maren turned her attention back to Silas, stripping away the frozen layers of clothing until he was down to his union suit. She wrapped him in the fire-warmed blankets, tucking them around his body with careful precision. "Stay with me," she murmured, pressing her palm to his cheek. His skin was cold, so terribly cold, but she could feel the flutter of his pulse beneath her fingers. "You promised your daughter you'd come back. Don't you dare break that promise now." His eyes opened again, clearer this time. "Maren." Her name was barely a whisper, rough and broken. "I'm here." "The horse, he needs—" "Theo will see to the horse once we have you stable. Right now, you're the priority." He seemed to want to argue, but exhaustion won. His eyes drifted closed again, and Maren felt a surge of fear before she registered the steady rise and fall of his chest. Sleeping, not dying. She had to believe that. The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. Maren directed the children with quiet authority, warming Silas's extremities gradually with lukewarm compresses, feeding him sips of warm broth when he roused enough to swallow, keeping the fire built high but not so hot as to shock his system. Theo eventually went to tend to the exhausted horse, and Emmeline refused to leave her father's side, sitting on the floor beside the settee with her small hand wrapped around his larger one. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the color finally began returning to Silas's face. His breathing had deepened and steadied, and when Maren checked his feet, she found them pink rather than gray. The relief that flooded through her was so intense she had to grip the edge of the settee to keep from swaying. "He's going to be all right," she said, more to herself than to the silent child beside her. "He's going to be all right." Emmeline looked up at her, and for the first time there was something other than wariness in those green eyes, something that might have been gratitude or the beginning of trust. She lifted her hands and made a series of signs that Maren couldn't read.
I'm sorry, sweetheart.
I don't understand. The girl hesitated, her face working with some internal struggle. Then, in a voice rusty from disuse, barely louder than a breath, she spoke. Thank you. Maren's heart stopped. She stared at the child, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the moment like thin ice. You're welcome, she managed, her own voice thick with emotion. Emmeline's gaze dropped immediately, as if the effort of speaking had cost her something precious. But she didn't pull away when Maren reached out to gently touch her hair. The storm blew itself out by dawn, leaving behind a world transformed. Maren stood at the window, watching the sunrise over a landscape buried in white, and felt the exhaustion of the long night settle into her bones. Behind her, Silas slept on the settee, his color much improved, his breathing easy and regular. Emmeline had finally succumbed to sleep herself, curled up in the armchair with a quilt pulled over her small form. Theo appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes alert. Horse is fine. Ate half a bucket of oats and is sleeping in his stall. He paused, studying Maren with an expression that seemed far too old for his 11 years. You saved him, you know, Uncle Silas. If you hadn't known what to do, I did what anyone would have done. No, Theo shook his head firmly. You did what someone who belongs here would have done. The words settled into Maren's heart like seeds taking root. She turned back to the window, blinking against the sudden sting in her eyes. She'd come to Montana expecting to be a stranger's wife, a solution to a practical problem. She'd never expected to find herself fighting for a family that wasn't hers to claim. But perhaps, she thought, watching the sun paint the snow with gold and rose, perhaps belonging wasn't something that was given. Perhaps it was something you earned, one act of care at a time. The sound of hoofbeats shattered her reverie. Maren squinted against the glare of sun on snow, making out a figure on horseback approaching the ranch. As the rider drew closer, she recognized the black coat and the stiff posture of someone unaccustomed to the saddle. Theo, her voice was sharp. Who is that? The boy came to stand beside her, and she heard his sharp intake of breath. That's Reverend Whitmore. He never comes out here unless... He trailed off, his face suddenly pale. Unless what? Unless there's trouble. The rider reached the yard and dismounted with awkward care. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, with a face that seemed designed for disapproval. As he turned toward the house, Maren caught a glimpse of cold eyes beneath the brim of his hat, and somehow she knew that the storm they'd survived was nothing compared to what was coming. The cold followed Reverend Whitmore into the house like a faithful hound. He stood in the doorway, stamping snow from his boots with methodical precision, his gaze sweeping across the kitchen with the measured assessment of a man cataloging sins. I heard there was a woman here, he said without preamble. His voice was thin and reedy, like wind through a cracked window. The whole town's been talking. Maren stood her ground beside the stove where she'd been warming broth for Silas. 3 days had passed since the storm, 3 days of constant vigilance over his fever and careful tending of his frost-bitten feet. The worst had been avoided. He would keep all his toes, but he remained weak, drifting in and out of consciousness while his body fought to recover. I am the woman, she said simply. Maren Lindquist. The Reverend's lips pressed into a line so thin they nearly disappeared. The mail-order bride. The one who was abandoned, yes. And yet you remain, in the home of an unmarried man, with children present.
Each phrase fell like a stone dropped into still water, the implications rippling outward. Theo appeared in the doorway to the parlor, his young face set in an expression of stubborn defiance. She saved Uncle Silas's life. He would have died in that storm if she hadn't. Theodore! The Reverend's voice cracked like a whip. This is a conversation for adults. Return to your studies. But now! The boy's hands clenched at his sides, but he retreated, casting one fierce look at Maren before disappearing into the other room. She could hear his footsteps on the stairs, deliberately heavy with protest. Reverend Whitmore. Maren kept her voice steady, though her heart had begun to pound. Mr. Drummond took me in during a crisis. I had nowhere else to go. So I've heard. He moved further into the kitchen, uninvited, his eyes cataloging every detail. The bread rising on the counter, the clean dishes stacked beside the basin, the herbs drying above the stove. You've made yourself quite at home. I've made myself useful. Have you? It wasn't a question. He turned to face her fully, and she saw now what lay beneath his disapproving exterior. Not malice, exactly, but something perhaps worse. Certainty. The absolute conviction of a man who believed he alone understood the proper order of things. Miss Lindquist, I don't doubt your circumstances were difficult, but surely you understand how this appears. A young woman, foreign, from what I'm told, living under the roof of a widower, tending to his person, caring for his child. He shook his head slowly. The impropriety is severe. The alternative was letting him die. The alternative was summoning help, sending for the doctor, removing yourself to town where you might have found proper accommodation. In the middle of a blizzard, Maren's voice sharpened despite her efforts to remain calm. With a man suffering from hypothermia and a child who is terrified her father wouldn't survive. God provides. God provided me. The words came out before she could stop them, born of exhaustion and fear and 3 days of fighting for Silas's life while wondering when exactly the world would decide she'd done something wrong by refusing to let a good man die. The Reverend's face went rigid. You blaspheme. I speak the truth. I was there when he needed help. I knew what to do. If that was not providence, Reverend, then I don't know what is. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Maren could hear the fire crackling, the wind moaning against the windows, the distant sound of Emmeline's footsteps in the room above. Miss Lindquist. The Reverend's voice had gone soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. I am not your enemy. I am trying to protect you. Do you understand what people are saying? The speculation? A woman who came here to marry one man, then immediately took up residence with another. I took up residence in his barn. The words came out flat and hard. I slept in a horse stall until the storm made that impossible. I have been nothing but proper in my conduct. And yet here you stand in his kitchen wearing an apron while he lies helpless in his bed. The Reverend's eyebrows rose. Can you not see how that looks? Maren's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter. She wanted to scream at him, to demand he explain what exactly she should have done differently. Let Silas freeze? Let his children watch their father die? Abandon them all to propriety's sake? But she knew, had always known, that the world rarely asked what was right, only what was acceptable. What would you have me do? She asked quietly. The Reverend's expression softened slightly, as if her submission had satisfied some requirement. Return to town with me, today.
I've spoken with Mrs. Hartley at the boarding house. She's willing to take you in until more suitable arrangements can be made.
And Mr. Drummond? The children?
I'll send someone to help. One of the church women, perhaps. Someone whose presence here won't raise questions.
Someone whose presence here won't ruin everything I've built, Maren thought bitterly. Someone who belongs. She was about to respond, to agree perhaps, because what choice did she have, when a sound from the doorway made them both turn. Silas stood there, one hand braced against the frame, his face gray with effort. He wore only his shirt and trousers, his feet wrapped in the bandages Maren had changed just that morning. He looked like a man who should be in bed, who might collapse at any moment, but his eyes were clear and cold.
"Get out of my house!" The Reverend drew himself up. "Silas, you're not well. You don't understand."
"I understand perfectly."
Silas's voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority.
"You came here to take away the woman who saved my life, the woman who's kept my daughter calm and my nephew fed while I was too sick to lift my head. And you want me to thank you for it?"
"I want you to consider your reputation, your children's future, the scandal."
"There is no scandal."
Silas took a step forward, swaying slightly. Maren moved instinctively toward him, but he held up a hand to stop her.
"Miss Lindquist has been nothing but honorable. She's worked harder than any hired hand I've ever had. She's earned her place here." "Earned her?" the Reverend sputtered. "Silas, listen to yourself. She's a stranger, a woman who came here to marry another man entirely. A man who abandoned her, just like Finch abandoned her. Just like everyone in this town would have let her freeze on that platform if I hadn't stepped forward." Silas's jaw tightened. "I know what people are saying, Whitmore. I've been sick, not deaf, and I don't give a damn." The Reverend's face flushed red. "You may not care about your own reputation, but think of Emmeline. Think of what people will say about her growing up in a household of sin." "There is no sin here." Silas's voice rose, then broke into a cough that bent him double. Maren reached him before he fell, sliding under his arm to support his weight. He leaned into her without hesitation, without shame, and she felt something shift in the room. The Reverend saw it too. His eyes narrowed. "I see," he said quietly. "I see exactly what's happening here." "Nothing is happening," Maren said sharply. "He's ill. He needs to rest. What he needs is guidance." "What you both need, what we need," Silas interrupted, his voice steadier now, "is for you to leave. Now. Before I forget that you're a man of God and throw you out myself." The threat hung in the air, absurd given Silas's condition, yet somehow entirely believable. The Reverend must have thought so too, because he took a step back, his face settling into an expression of wounded dignity. "I'll go," he said. "But this isn't over, Silas. The church board meets next week. There will be questions, consequences. Let them come." The Reverend gathered his coat and hat, pausing at the door to deliver one final pronouncement. "I tried to help you. Remember that. When everything falls apart, remember that I tried." The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid. Maren helped Silas to a chair, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. He slumped forward, elbows on the table, breathing hard from the exertion. "That was foolish," she said quietly. "You should be in bed." "Probably." He looked up at her,
and something in his expression made her breath catch. But I couldn't let him. I couldn't stand there and listen to him talk about you like that. Like what?
Like you are something shameful. His hand found hers on the table, his fingers cold and rough. You're not. You're the best thing that's happened to this house in years. Maren's eyes burned. She wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that she was nothing special, that she'd only done what anyone would do. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Theo appeared first, his face anxious, followed by Emmeline, pale and wide-eyed, clutching her father's old coat like a talisman. "Is he gone?" Theo asked. "The Reverend?" "He's gone," Silas confirmed. "Good." The boy's chin lifted. "I never liked him anyway." A sound escaped Silas, almost a laugh, though it turned into another cough. Maren moved to help him up, to guide him back to bed, but Emmeline got there first. The girl slipped under her father's other arm, small but determined, and together the three of them, Maren, Silas, and his silent daughter, made their way toward the stairs. They had almost reached the bottom step when Emmeline spoke. "Don't leave." 2 words, barely a whisper, but they stopped Maren cold. She looked down at the girl, at those serious gray eyes so like her father's, and felt something break open in her chest. "Emmy?" Silas's voice cracked. But his daughter wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Maren, her small hand reaching out to grip the fabric of Maren's sleeve. "Don't leave," she said again. "Please." And Maren, who had spent her whole life leaving home, leaving hope, leaving everything she'd ever loved, found that she couldn't speak at all. Because for the first time someone was asking her to stay. The sound of hoofbeats outside shattered the moment. Theo ran to the window, his face going pale. "It's not the Reverend," he said slowly. There's a whole group of them. 4 riders, and one of them is Franklin Jessup." Maren's blood turned to ice. The man who had sent for her. The man who had taken one look at her face and walked away. He was here. The riders approached in formation, their horses' hooves cutting through the snow with a sound like muffled thunder. Maren watched them through the frost-etched window, her heart hammering against her ribs as she counted the figures. 4 men, their breath and their mounts mingling in clouds of white vapor against the steel-gray morning sky. Franklin Jessup rode at the front. She recognized him instantly, even from this distance. The rigid set of his shoulders, the expensive cut of his coat, the way he held himself as though the world existed solely for his convenience. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't know, rough-looking fellows with the hard eyes of hired hands who asked few questions about their employer's business. "Miss Maren?" Theo's voice wavered. "Who is that man?" "Someone from my past," she said quietly. "Someone I had hoped never to see again." From the bedroom she heard Silas stir, heard the creak of the bed frame as he tried to rise. She turned and moved quickly to the doorway, holding up her hand. "Stay down," she said firmly. "You're in no condition." "I heard riders." His voice was rough with fever, but his eyes had cleared somewhat from the delirium of the past days. He pushed himself upright against the headboard, his jaw tight with pain. "How many?" 4. "And one of them is the man who is supposed to marry me." Silas went very still. In the pale light filtering through the curtains, she could see the muscle working in his cheek, the way his hands curled into fists against the quilted coverlet. "Help me up." "Silas, your feet." "Help me up, Maren." It was the first time he had used her Christian name.
The sound of it on his lips, low and certain and fierce, sent something rushing through her that she couldn't name. She moved to his side and slipped her arm beneath his shoulders, taking his weight as he swung his bandaged feet to the floor. He hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. "My boots," he said. "The ones by the door." "You can't possibly—" "I can stand." He looked at her then, and in his fever-bright eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. "I won't let you face him alone." The knock came before she could argue, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the house like gunshots. Emmeline appeared in the hallway, her face white as milk, her small hands pressed flat against her chest.
Theo moved to stand beside her, placing himself between his cousin and the door with a protective instinct that made him seem suddenly older than his 11 years. "Take the children to the back room," Silas said quietly. "Keep them there until I call for you." "No," Maren lifted her chin. "Whatever he wants, whatever he's come to say, I won't hide from it. I've spent my whole life hiding, Silas. Running. Letting other people decide my fate because I was too afraid to stand my ground." She drew a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass. "Not anymore." The knock came again, harder this time. Silas studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Together, then." She helped him to the main room, where he lowered himself into the chair by the cold fireplace. His rifle hung on the wall behind him. She saw his eyes flick toward it, saw him calculate the distance. But he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Maren crossed to the door and opened it. Franklin Jessup stood on the porch, his fine coat dusted with snow, his handsome face arranged in an expression of practiced concern. Up close she could see the things she had missed in that first terrible moment on the platform. The cruel set of his mouth, the coldness in his pale blue eyes, the way he looked at her as though she were an object to be assessed rather than a person to be known. "Miss Lindquist." He removed his hat with a flourish. "I've been searching for you." "Have you?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's curious, Mr. Jessup. The last time I saw you, you were walking away from me without a word of explanation." A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or the wounded pride of a man unaccustomed to being challenged, crossed his features. "There was a misunderstanding. The photograph you sent, it didn't do you justice." "You mean it made me look prettier than I am?" He had the grace to flush, at least. "I was surprised, that's all. I acted rashly. But I've had time to reconsider, and I've come to make things right." His gaze slid past her to where Silas sat, watchful and silent, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I've come to collect my bride." "I'm not your bride, Mr. Jessup. I was never your bride." "You abandoned me on that platform without so much as a word of farewell. A mistake I'm prepared to rectify." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I have the marriage license here, already signed by the county clerk. All that's required is your signature and a witness, and we can be married within the hour." Maren stared at him. "You can't possibly believe I would agree to that." "I believe you're a practical woman, Miss Lindquist." His voice dropped, taking on an edge that made her skin crawl. "I've made inquiries. I know about your circumstances, the debt your father left behind, the way you lost your position in St. Paul. I know you came west with nothing but a carpet bag and a handful of coins." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm offering you security, comfort, a name. What can this?" He gestured dismissively toward Silas, toward the modest house, toward everything that had come to feel like home. "What can any of this offer you?" "More than you could ever understand." The voice came from behind her,
low and rough and burning with quiet fury. Maren turned to see Silas rising from his chair, his face pale with pain but his eyes blazing.
He moved toward the door with a limping gait that should have made him seem weak, but somehow didn't. "The lady has given you her answer," Silas said. "I suggest you accept it." Franklin's lip curled. "And who are you to speak for her?"
The man who took advantage of her desperation? The widower who brought an unmarried woman into his home to warm his bed and raise his motherless child?
The words hung in the air like poison.
Maren felt them strike her like physical blows, not because they were true, but because she knew how they would sound to others, how they had already sounded to Reverend Whitmore, how they would spread through Copper Creek like wildfire, destroying whatever fragile reputation she might have built. "You know nothing about what happened here," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Nothing about the storm, or the children, or—" "I know what I see." Franklin's smile turned predatory. "An unmarried woman, a widowed man, a scandal that will follow you both for the rest of your lives, unless, of course, you come with me now. Marry me, Miss Lindquist, and all of this disappears. Your reputation restored.
Your future secured." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Refuse me, and I'll make certain every person in this territory knows exactly what kind of woman you are."
"Get off my land!" Silas's voice was quiet, but something in it made Franklin take a step backward. The three hired men shifted uneasily on their horses, their hands moving toward their belts. "I don't think you're in any position to make demands, Mr. Drummond." Franklin's eyes flicked to Silas's bandaged feet, to the way he swayed slightly where he stood. "You can barely stand. Your ranch is mortgaged to the hilt. Your daughter hasn't spoken a word in 2 years. What exactly do you have to offer this woman that I can't provide 100-fold?
Himself. The word came from the doorway behind them, small and fierce and startlingly clear. Everyone turned. Emmeline stood in the hall, her red hair wild around her pale face, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her eyes, Silas's eyes, storm-gray and burning, were fixed on Franklin Jessup with an intensity that seemed far too old for her 8 years. "He offers himself," she said again, and her voice cracked on the words but didn't break. "His kindness, his goodness, his heart, things you don't have, things you'll never have." The silence that followed was absolute. Maren felt tears burning in her eyes, not from sadness but from something far more powerful: wonder, gratitude, love for this fierce, broken, beautiful child who had finally found her voice. Silas made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. He reached out and Emmeline ran to him, burying her face against his chest as his arms closed around her. "Emmy," he breathed. "Oh, Emmy." Franklin Jessup's face had gone an ugly shade of red.
"This is ridiculous. The girl is clearly disturbed."
"The girl," Maren said coldly, "has more courage in her smallest finger than you have in your entire body." She stepped forward, placing herself between Franklin and the family behind her. "You heard her. You heard all of us. Now leave, Mr. Jessup. Leave and don't come back." "You're making a mistake." His voice had turned ugly, stripped of its veneer of civility.
"You think this backwater rancher can protect you? You think his crippled feet and his mute daughter and his failing ranch will give you the life you deserve?"
He laughed, and the sound was bitter. You'll regret this, Miss Lindquist. Mark my words, you'll regret this. He turned on his heel and strode back to his horse, mounting with sharp, angry movements. His hired men followed without a word. As they rode away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the winter morning, Maren felt something unknot in her chest. It was over. She turned back to find Silas still holding Emmeline, his face buried in her hair. When he looked up, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. "She spoke," he said hoarsely. "Maren, she spoke." "I heard." Maren's own voice was thick with emotion. "I heard every word." Emmeline pulled back from her father's embrace and looked at Maren with those gray eyes, so like Silas's, so full of something that looked terrifyingly like hope. "Will you stay?" she asked. Her voice was rusty from disuse, uncertain, fragile as spun glass. "Please, will you stay?" Maren knelt before her, taking those small, cold hands in her own. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." The word felt like a vow, like a prayer, like the beginning of something she had never dared to dream. From outside came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, different this time, lighter, faster. Theo ran to the window. "It's Mrs. Suttner," he said, his voice puzzled, "from the boarding house in town, and she's got Reverend Whitmore with her." Maren's heart clenched. Whatever peace they had found, whatever victory they had won, it seemed the world wasn't finished with them yet. The door burst open without a knock, and Opal Suttner swept into the room like a force of nature, her sharp eyes taking in everything at once. "Well," she said briskly, brushing snow from her severe black dress, "I see I've arrived just in time to prevent you all from making complete fools of yourselves." She fixed Maren with a gaze that could have cut glass. "You, girl, I have a proposition for you, and before you refuse, you should know it's the only thing standing between this family and complete ruin." Behind her, Reverend Whitmore stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. And Maren, still kneeling before Emmeline, still holding the child's hands in her own, felt the ground shift beneath her feet once more. The woman who swept into Silas Drummond's parlor carried herself like a general surveying a battlefield. She was perhaps 60, with steel-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her weathered skin, and eyes the same storm cloud color as Silas's own. She wore mourning black that had faded to charcoal at the seams, suggesting years of wear rather than recent grief. "Aunt Harriet," Silas said, and Maren heard something in his voice she'd never detected before. Uncertainty, perhaps even a trace of boyhood deference. "Don't Aunt Harriet me, nephew." The woman's gaze swept the room, taking in Franklin Jessup's retreating form through the window, the children clustered near the kitchen doorway, Maren still kneeling on the floor with Emmeline's hands in hers. "I've traveled 4 days on trains that should have been condemned to scrap metal, eaten food that would make a goat weep, and arrived to find you facing down hired thugs in your nightshirt with fever sweat still on your brow. You will sit down before you fall down, and you will listen." Silas sat. Maren rose slowly, keeping one hand on Emmeline's shoulder. The girl had pressed close against her side, and Maren could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her dress. "Mrs. Maren began. "Drummond, Harriet Drummond. I was married to Silas's uncle for 37 years before the Lord saw fit to take him, and I've spent those years watching this family make one noble, foolish decision after another." She turned to Reverend Whitmore, who still stood in the doorway looking rather like a man who'd summoned a hurricane and now regretted it.
Close the door, Reverend. You're letting in the cold." The Reverend complied, his earlier righteous certainty visibly deflating. "Now then," Harriet Drummond settled herself into the chair nearest the fire as though she owned it. "Miss Lindquist, yes, I know your name. I read the letter Silas sent 3 weeks ago, though he clearly didn't expect me to actually come. I understand you arrived in Copper Creek expecting to marry one man and found yourself taken in by another." "That's a simplified version, ma'am." "I don't have time for complicated versions. I have time for facts." Harriet's sharp gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it fell on Emmeline, still pressed against Maren's side.
"Facts such as my great-niece, who hasn't willingly touched a stranger in 2 years, currently holding your hand as though you're the only solid thing in the room." Maren looked down. Emmeline's small fingers had indeed woven through hers, gripping with surprising strength.
"Facts such as my nephew," Harriet continued, "who hasn't written me a personal letter since his wife's funeral, suddenly feeling compelled to inform me that circumstances at the ranch have changed and that he's met someone who, how did you phrase it, Silas? Sees what needs doing and does it without being asked?" She raised an eyebrow. "High praise from a man who communicates primarily in grunts and gestures." Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "And facts such as Reverend Whitmore here," Harriet gestured toward the minister, "who wrote to me separately expressing concerns about impropriety and suggesting I might want to intervene before my nephew's reputation was irreparably damaged." Her voice could have frozen the fire in the grate. "As though Silas Drummond's reputation has ever been anything other than that of a good man who does right by those in his care." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Mrs.
Drummond, You were merely being a busybody, Reverend, and we both know it. But your busybodying has accidentally served a useful purpose, so I'll thank you for it once and never mention it again." She turned back to Maren. "Now, my proposition." Maren felt Silas's gaze on her, steady and warm despite the fever still flushing his cheeks. She felt Emmeline's hand in hers, small and trusting. She felt Theo hovering in the kitchen doorway, his nervous energy barely contained. "I'm listening," she said. "I'm 71 years old," Harriet said bluntly. "I have a house in Helena that's too large for one woman, a modest income from my late husband's investments, and no children of my own to leave it to. I came here intending to offer you employment as my companion, a respectable position that would remove you from this situation while preserving everyone's precious reputation." She paused. "But I've been watching you for the past 5 minutes, and I've changed my mind." "Changed it to what?" "To recognizing what's plainly obvious to everyone except perhaps you and my stubborn nephew." Harriet's expression softened further, becoming almost gentle. "You don't want to leave. And he doesn't want you to go. And those children," she nodded toward Emmeline and Theo, "need someone who'll stay." The word hung in the air. Stay. "Aunt Harriet," Silas said quietly, "this isn't—" "Don't tell me what this isn't, Silas James Drummond. I've known you since you were smaller than Theo and twice as stubborn. I watched you court Colleen for 2 years before you worked up the courage to speak to her, and I watched you nearly destroy yourself with grief when she died." Harriet's voice cracked slightly. "I won't watch you let something good slip away because you're too proud or too scared to reach for it." Silence fell over the room like snow. Maren looked at Silas, really looked at him.
at the gray threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of sun and wind and worry, at the way he held himself despite his exhaustion, still trying to protect, still trying to be strong enough for everyone.
"Silas,"
she said softly. He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw everything he couldn't say. The loneliness of the past 2 years, the weight of raising 2 grieving children alone, the terror he'd felt during the storm, not of dying, but of leaving them behind, and something else, something that looked like hope, fragile and uncertain like the first green shoots pushing through snow. Maren. Her name in his voice was a question and an answer all at once. Emmeline tugged at Maren's hand. When Maren looked down, the girl was making a sign, one Maren didn't recognize, something private between Emmeline and her father. But Silas did. His breath caught, and for a moment his composure cracked entirely. "What did she say?" Maren whispered. Silas's voice was rough. She said, please." It was Theo who broke the moment, unable to contain himself any longer. "Does this mean she's staying? Miss Lindquist, are you staying?" Maren looked at the boy's hopeful, freckled face, at Emmeline still gripping her hand, her copper-red hair catching the firelight, at Silas, who was watching her with an expression that made her heart ache in the best possible way. "I came to Montana to build a life," she said slowly. "I didn't expect it to look like this. I thought I'd be grateful for mere safety, for simple kindness." She took a breath. "But I found something more.
I've found a family that needs me and that I need in return." "Is that a yes?" Theo demanded. Maren laughed, a real laugh, the first one in longer than she could remember. "That's a yes." Emmeline made a small sound, not quite a word, but something close, something that might, with time and patience and love, become speech again. Harriet Drummond rose from her chair with the satisfied air of a woman who'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. "Well then, Reverend, I believe you have a wedding to arrange. Something small and proper within the week if possible. I'll stay to ensure everything is done correctly." The Reverend, thoroughly chastened, nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Drummond." "And Silas," Harriet crossed to her nephew and, in a gesture that surprised everyone, pressed a kiss to his fevered forehead. "Your mother would be proud of you. Your father, too, though he'd never have admitted it." She straightened. "Now get back to bed before you undo all of Miss Lindquist's careful nursing." You can court her properly once you're well enough to stand without swaying. The wedding took place 6 days later, in the small parlor of the ranch house because Silas's feet were still too tender for the walk to church. Harriet had produced a dress from somewhere, cream-colored wool, simple but elegant, and had spent hours altering it to fit Maren's frame. Emmeline served as flower girl, scattering dried lavender from a basket Theo had woven himself. She didn't speak, but when the Reverend pronounced Silas and Maren man and wife, she smiled, a real smile, bright and sudden as sunshine breaking through clouds. Theo cried, though he denied it vigorously afterward. And Silas, when he lifted Maren's veil and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, spoke more words than she'd heard from him in all their weeks together. "I'm not good with words," he said quietly so only she could hear. "Never have been. But I want you to know I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this. Never regret staying." "I know," Maren whispered back. "I already know."
When he kissed her, gentle and sure, Maren felt something she'd stopped believing in long ago settle into her chest and take root. Home. She was home. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and turning the brown hills green. Maren planted a garden behind the house, vegetables and herbs, but also flowers because beauty mattered too. Emmeline helped her, small hands patting soil around seedlings, and one afternoon in late April, as they worked side by side in comfortable silence, the girl spoke. "Mama." Just one word, barely a whisper. Maren went still, her heart stopping and starting again in a new rhythm. "Mama," Emmeline said again more firmly, "the carrots need more water." Maren gathered the child into her arms and held her close, dirt and all, and wept into that copper-red hair while Emmeline patted her back with patient, gentle hands. From the porch, Silas watched them. His feet had healed well. He'd lost no toes, though the doctor said it was a near thing, and he stood steady and strong in the spring sunshine. Theo bounded up beside him. "Uncle Silas, why is Aunt Maren crying?"
Did something bad happen?
Silas shook his head slowly, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "No, Theo, something good happened." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Something very good." In the garden below, Maren released Emmeline and wiped her eyes, laughing at herself. The girl tugged her back toward the carrots with determined purpose, already chattering about which plants needed what. And Maren Drummond, who had arrived in Copper Creek with nothing but a carpet bag and fading hope, looked up at her husband on the porch, at her son beside him, at her daughter kneeling in the spring earth, and knew that some journeys end not where we expect, but exactly where we're meant to be. The end. The story appears to be complete. The text ends with "the end," which indicates the author has already concluded the narrative with a satisfying ending.